It is not for black people not to see color to transform the world. It is for other people, and particularly for whites, and I'm not waiting on that, not to see color. We are suffering not because we chose to see ourselves as colored or not colored, but because others see us in that vein and react to us in that vein, and it is for their perceptions to change. But again, you see this old martyr complex on the part of the oppressed, thinking that letting themselves be nailed to the cross is somehow going to save the world. It only is going to get you nailed to the cross. He goes on here to say then, so there are many blacks who want to see race in purely racial terms, just as a means belonging to a group who have in common a certain skin color and other physical features. And of course, then he talks about the other side of blackness, which I will refer to a bit later. So then we should ask ourselves, are these articles coincidental? Why are they being published at this juncture? What function are they playing within the political establishment? What is this concept of identity and of self? What is this concept of individuality? What is an individual anyway? We don't spend enough time thinking about that. One of the things that we must debunk immediately is the idea that a person can be completely individual and separated completely from society. In fact, individuality has no meaning other than in a society. If you are in the world completely alone, no one else existed, why would you even think about individuality? There's no meaning whatsoever. Why would you even think about identity, race, or anything else? These things come to have meaning and operate within a social context. The concept of personal and social identity takes on meaning relative to other people, relative to a social system. Identity, by its very nature, is a social concept. It is no way you're going to escape the social in your personality. One's identity begins before he or she is even born. It begins in the womb itself. The society begins to shape the personality from the very first moment of conception. However one's identity is defined and assigned, however such an identity is expressed, it has social ramifications and produces social effects. Because one acts one's identity out within a social system. I don't care how you define it. If you're living in a society, it has social effects and social influences. Individual definition and expression is achieved within the social structure. Self-identity is confirmed by repeated and relatively consistent social interactions. To have an identity means that you have some kind of boundaries around your mental and physical personality. Those boundaries have to be defined relative to those outside of those boundaries. Those boundaries are maintained by those structures and people outside. In fact, one does not achieve an identity in the fullest sense until that identity is confirmed by other people. You know, you can say, I am the king, if you want to. You can say it all you want to, but until others defer to you and bow to your presence and follow your command, in reality, you're not. It takes the behavior and attitude and the relations of other people to confirm what you may even call an individual identity. They have to relate to you in some particular set of ways. The idea then that you can have an identity unconfirmed, unrelated to a social system is totally illogical. This man who says he is neither black nor white will still turn around and call himself a singer, which requires what? An audience, people to listen, people to buy records, people to respond to him as what? A singer. If he were in the middle of the forest, totally alone, what difference would it make if he sang or not? How could he define himself? The word singer, the word dancer, only has meaning within a social, political context. It's just like the context people talk about of being independently wealthy. How are you going to be independently wealthy? These are my dollars. A dollar is nothing but a printed piece of paper. That is all it is in essence. The dollar is a social instrument, and its value must be accepted by other people. Therefore, it can never belong to you alone. It only has value because it is a social instrument. You never own it by yourself, for yourself, and to yourself. If you did, it would not be accepted as what? Money. But of course, the bourgeois society wants to create this so that it can make the poor and these other people it rips off think that they do not give meaning to wealth and riches. And that ultimately, what we call wealth and what we call riches is a creation of the group, not of some person who lifts him or herself up by their bootstrap and who is a self-made person. A self-made person is self-made within a social context and is maintained in their wealth by a social context. And therefore, all of the money that they have ultimately is money that belongs to the group and is a group creation. But of course, we want to run a game on your head to take your money, use all of your money, use it against you, saying it's all mine and I'm independently wealthy. We never think about, and there's so many other concepts like private property, total thievery. You never own any property. You just rent it. You said you paid for it. You finished your mortgage. Stop paying your taxes. See how long you got it and watch the group take it right back from you. You don't own it. You just rent it. You see? But this is the game that's run on the mind of people. What makes an individual, what makes us individual is our unique ways of integrating and expressing and relating to community, to shared social knowledge, techniques, resources, and values. The material we individualize is in essence social material, made available by a social system, a set of social relations. In other words, we are individual in our individual ways of dealing with social things and relating to social things, not that we are uniquely individual. Then we would speak our own language. You want to know that you want to really see the ultimate individual? Look at the schizophrenic in full bloom. Has his own glossolalia, salad language, living in his own total reality, disembodied, doesn't know where his body ends or begins. He's all people and every people. An echo chamber, so everybody he meets, he echoes them. He can't distinguish himself from anything else there. Locked in his own world, locked away from reality. And therefore, he has to now be taken care of by others because he becomes a danger to himself and sometimes others. As I said earlier, the social system is not out there, it is within each of us. The individual is a social creation. That's why individuals in different societies differ from other individuals in other societies, because they individually represent their social group. The individual helps to maintain the social situation and helps to maintain the social situation. If you are so individual, why then does social disintegration, the disintegration of a social system, leads so often to individual disintegration? People beginning to lose their minds, beginning to lose their sense of self, their sense of direction and purpose and meaning when the society itself becomes unraveled. People committing suicide during depressions and other things when jobs are lost. All of those self-made people and self-determining people all of a sudden coming loose when the social system itself begins to fall apart. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that social structure that builds the infrastructure of the individual. And now you're going to have some jokers who want to come along and try to make you think that you can be a person totally unto yourself, and that the essence of freedom represents atomized individuals operating with no relationship to community and no communal obligations and so forth. What purpose does this kind of approach serve? We have to ask ourselves that. Those who are talking about themselves now as individuals, those such as Julius Lester, who sees being black as some form of social fascism. And I remember Julius quite well. Look out, whitey, black power's gonna get your mama, you know, and that other kind of stuff. Heavy into black, wasn't he? Used black, caught up in black. And it's interesting now, once he's achieved what being black got for him, he turns around and denies it. That's why we felt disappointed with Clarence Thomas and the other people. You're going to use it. You're going to gain the fruits from the use of blackness. You're going to get your job from our demanding quotas and other things in terms of blackness, not everybody-ness, but blackness. And now you're going to turn around and tell us that blackness has nothing to do with it, and it's not important. Interestingly, it was as a common identity, as imposed, sometimes as shared oppression, culture, politics, social behavior, acting against oppression, which to a significant degree has brought us to the present impasse. We have gotten people then who want to equate atomistic individualism with freedom. I would say, to a good degree, we're seeing this kind of thing going on in the black community, particularly by some individuals in the black community, because we perhaps didn't notice that these seeds were already a part of the so-called civil rights movement, but they were hidden by our focus and our attention on achieving our so-called civil rights, and by our dealing with our obvious oppression. For many blacks, if I can recall, who fought during that time, were fighting for what they call individualism and were equating individualism with freedom. Many, we realize now then, were fighting to identify with their aggressor. As Paulo Freire says, for many of the oppressed, to be free means to be like the oppressor. And consequently, there were many of us during that struggle who thought that white folks and their behavior and attitudes, their privileges and so forth, represented what it means to be free, without realizing that if to be free is to be like one's oppressor, then the day that one becomes like one's oppressor, one becomes self-oppressing. And one becomes an ally in the oppression of one's own people. And again, in black-on-black violence, this is what I'm saying, that the black-on-black violent criminal, in a sense, becomes an ally of white racism. He wants to imitate the murderous attitudes of the white man being the greatest murderer the world has ever seen, the greatest killer, robber, and rapist the world has ever known. Yes, I used to hear you say you want your children to be just like them without thinking. Our enslavers, the assassinators of our personality, those people who lynched us, those people who deprived us, those people who killed nations and nations of Indians and others, those people who, wherever they stepped on this earth, the local populations were degraded, those people who developed great death machines and polluted the earth and the world itself. Those killers and murderers is what we desired to be like, and represented to many of us what it means to be free. When you take upon yourself that definition of what it means to be free, there is no wonder then that we engage in the killing of ourselves. When we identify with killers and identify with people who kill us, then we ultimately must engage in suicide and self-destruction. And this is often what has happened. There were too many who read freedom to being like white folk. And they fought then the oppression that was coming to us all, not to transform a system and not to reduce the power of an oppressive group, but to gain the right to more closely identify with their oppressors. Many were fighting using the concept of blackness not so much to identify with us, but to dissociate themselves from us. And that's almost sort of hidden in this concept of once we gain our great freedom, people would not see us as colored. They would look at us as some form of abstraction. Why can't people see you in your reality? If you are black or whatever color you are, why cannot people see you as you are? Why is it that we demand that they play some kind of perceptual trick on themselves and not see us in our reality and in the color we present to them, since they have color cones in their eyes designed to see color, and then deal with us honestly and fairly? Have we bought the idea then that if people see us in our true color, that they are bound to mistreat us? This leads us to the idea then that it is our color that is the cause of our oppression, and not the madness and insanity of others who are oppressing us. And therefore, when you internalize this kind of concept, you see freedom as dissociating yourself from your color and trying to get others not to look at your colored reality, so that both can be insane, so that the other who's looking cannot see you for who you are, and you cannot see yourself for who you are. And therefore there were those who fought as black people in order not to be seen as black people. The very essence of schizophrenia, again, and madness, is dissociation. A cutting off of the individual from his reality, and a form of alienation. There were other of us who fought and fell behind the black banner during the civil rights era, not as Maddox tells us, I think very importantly here, Attorney Maddox, not so much for civil rights as for consumer rights. And it becomes sort of interesting that the civil rights struggle centered around lunch counters and retail stores. And you begin to realize that while this certainly was not the whole of civil rights, that there was an aspect having to do with consumption. The right to take our money and give it to people who hated our guts. And we see this still going on today. And again, we talk about this in on black violence. People don't want to live next to you, hate the sight of you, miseducate the children, want to continue their oppression. And then what do? Beat each other up so that we can carry our money to them, buy the bus loads, and feel proud of ourselves and feel good after we've given it to them. And then we'll say, why are you doing that? It's my right as a United States citizen. I'm telling you, you look at it very closely, and you will see to a great extent many of the rights that we claim we have were really set up in a way so that the white community could get greater access to black resources and money. And watch, as we became desegregated, we engage in the wholesale disinvestment of the black community. And to a great extent, it's a result of getting caught up in these consumer rights, which is another game, by the way, to buy what I want, when I want it, as an expression of freedom. Watch that concept. I was talking to one man here in Chicago who was complaining about his daughter being mistreated by his white neighbors, he being the only black one in the neighborhood. What can I do about that? That's right. Oh no, but it's my right to live where I want to live. And you know, this is the expression of my right. And it's interesting that when we get through defining our rights, it almost always means carrying our money to white folk and giving our resources to white folk. But the ultimate thing that it means is that white oppression did not end there, did it? His right to buy into a neighborhood made his oppression even more clear. He brought his children into even more naked oppression by the very rights that he thought he had won and that he thought he was exercising. And to a great extent, the black community had run into that impasse. After getting all the fair housing laws and all of the lunch counter laws and the desegregation laws and the other laws passed, we were fit to be free at last, and yet we look up, and where are we? Suffering, still talking about what? The miseducation of our children, still talking about criminality in our communities, still talking about disease running rampant, still talking about poverty and unemployment. It was, as the French says, the more things change, the more they what? Remain the same. We begin to realize then that this freedom of consumption was not liberation. You have to recognize then, and we must recognize that there's a difference in class consciousness and individualized consciousness. And what is going on here today is an attempt to impose on black people an individualized consciousness and to make us believe that by being totally free and disconnected as individuals, we will be free as a people. That is the very opposite of what is going to occur. The more we push for our own unique individual freedom, the more we will come under the domination and oppression of others as a group. There is no ultimate individual freedom, ladies and gentlemen, as black people, if there is not group freedom. The powerless individual is not seen as an individual anyway. That is why we talk about what? Stereotyping. That is why the slave master, our masters calls us what? Field hands. Not individuals, workers, laborers, because there's what? A category of people there. We only bother to individualize those who are powerful. Individual freedom is made possible by group freedom and by group power. It is the power of the group that provides room for individual expression. Powerless groups do not have individual expression and are not perceived as individual. If you want to get the maximum of individual expression and freedom, you must maximize your group power and strength in the world. Quickly here, quoting Michael Parenti, businessmen collectively constitute the most class-conscious group in American society. As a class, they are more highly organized, more easily mobilized, have more facilities for communication, are more like-minded, and are more accustomed to stand together in defense of their privileges than any other group. And yet this is the group that depends on the consumption of our people. The ruling class is different from the subordinate classes, not only in terms of possessing more wealth. See, we like to think that rich people are rich only because they have more money. Watch that. And more power and more prestige. But more importantly, in terms of their ownership of the means of production and their concern with production and their desire to conserve, expand, and increase these factors. The rich own the means of production and concern themselves with maintaining that ownership and expanding that ownership and controlling that ownership. This is a very important difference between rich and poor. It's just not more money and less money. This ownership and these concerns on the part of the ruling group induces in them a class consciousness, a group solidarity and action orientation, markedly different from their lower class counterparts. Under capitalism, ruling class power and wealth is to a very significant degree founded on the consumerism of the subordinate classes, and consequently the subordinate classes must be socialized into consumerism, not socialized into production, but socialized into what? Consumption. This is why again and again I try to get across to people that one of the essences of an African-centered education is that the African-centered education is designed not to just see that you're better qualified to get jobs, to take advantage of opportunity offered by other people. You see, African-centered education rejects the market definition of why people are being educated in the first place. Because when we talk about making our children qualified and getting them prepared to take advantage of opportunities, we are also making the assumption that the opportunities that are being offered are not being offered by us. We are still assuming that the ownership of jobs and opportunity will be in the hands of other people. And I've asked people before, what makes you assume that the jobs will even be there? What makes you assume that whites will even offer you the job? Therefore, it is not enough for you to merely getting education, merely to read better, merely to go to the right schools. You are still making an assumption that those other people will offer you the jobs and give you the opportunities merely because you're qualified. And African-centered education involves itself then not with the mere qualification of our people and not with the mere preparation of them to take advantage of opportunities, but it must prepare them to create opportunities and to create jobs and to create ownership and to be productive, not consumers only. You see, that means then that African people have to achieve a whole different type of consciousness than is present today in our community. That is why I talk about African-centered education as having an intentionality, and it is that intentionality that transforms the education of black people. What do you intend to do? Not what has happened to you, not what you are missing, not the idea that your children are not reading as well or they're not doing math as well. That is not the stimulus for African-centered education. The stimulus for African-centered education is, what do we want as a people and how are we going to get it and what are our intentions in the world? And how then are we going to educate our children so that those intentions can be fulfilled and actualized as a people? Because what did I tell you before? Colin Powell knows how to read well, and yet he uses his reading capacity to bomb and destroy black people. So it's not enough to teach them to read well. Other black mathematicians have worked on U.S. projects, nuclear research and bombs and so forth, so that they may be dropped on African populations. Ronald McNair and others were learned in physics. And what were they being used to do? To seed space with weapons so that the United States could intimidate African nations and destroy African nations from 400 and 500 miles out in space. It is not enough to get your children just to read well and know math well. They must read for a reason. They must read for an African reason and purpose. There must be an African intentionality involved in their learning to read and write and to do mathematics. If they are not being educated merely to make more money so that they can spend more money, you will never spend yourself out of oppression. As a matter of fact, again referring to the black-on-black violence, through our habits of consumption, we actually finance our oppression. Yes. We enrich our oppressors, increase their wealth, increase their power, and we create and maintain within ourselves a consciousness that maintains our oppression. We are so caught up in the consciousness of consumerism that we commit violence against one another in order to engage in consumer behavior. We sell poison to our children. We corrupt our communities. We disinvest the wealth of our communities. And we think that this is an expression of freedom, and this is an expression of wealth and status. And this means that since we consume equally to white folk, since we drive the same cars as white folk, live in the same houses, in the same neighborhood as white folk, we are the same as white folks, you are foolish. It is that very sameness that is maintaining the inequality. I was trying to explain to my class the other evening the confusion people have of equating sameness with equality. You want your children to have the same education as white children. Then if you do, you want them to stay oppressed. Yes. You don't want them to be educated in terms of their unique history. You don't want them to be educated in terms of their learning styles. You don't want them to be educated in terms of the problems they have to solve for themselves. You don't want them to be educated in terms of the reality of the fact that they are oppressed, not white children. No, you want them educated as if they were white children. That is the surest way to maintain oppression, to ignore one's reality and to be educated out of sync with one's reality. The black man today is being educated to solve white folks' problems and to get status when he solves their problem. Yes. And sees himself as successful when he solves a problem for them. And you still can't get that same one to work on a single problem in the black community. As a matter of fact, he's at a loss as to how to use his talents and knowledge in the interests of black folk. Speaking of individual definition, his job loses definition once it steps outside of the white context. His self-definition, which is tied to his job definition, is lost. I've told you before, black people even define intelligence in terms of solving problems for white folk. The consumerism of our people then, as stated by Parenti, the socialization of people into consumerism serves to retard class consciousness. By consumerism, I'm quoting Parenti here, I am referring to the tendency to treat consumption, the consumption and accumulation of goods and services as a central purpose of life. And consumption is no longer just a means to life, but a meaning for life itself. And we can see this in the statistics of black people. This endless comparison of black income with white income? What percentage of black people earning of white income? As if that is the most important index of black freedom. Not what percentage of America do black people own? What percentage of the means of production do black people own? What kind of military and other kind of power do black people own compared to white folk? No, that's not even dealt with. What income do you have compared with white folk? And as I've told you before, there's a difference between income and wealth. Because you may make $100,000 or $200,000 a year, does not mean that you're equally as wealthy as another person who may be having income of $100,000 or $200,000 because they own $10 million worth of property. The person is worth $10 million. You are worth your monthly salary. Why do not we then compare wealth and the ownership of real estate? Why do we merely compare what? Income, which to a good extent is an index of consumption, not an index of ownership, not an index of power, not an index of control. And yet we are given these statistics over and over again. And therefore we have a consciousness of people who concentrate on income instead of wealth, consumption instead of production. And then you want to think because you got a salary equal to white folk that you're equal as wealthy. You got another thought comment. Consumerism is more than an attitude arising from personal greed. It is a mode of social behavior functional to capitalistic society. The corporate need is to produce more, to sell more, to profit more, to produce more, and so on endlessly. Under capitalism, the acquisitive impulse is not merely indulged, it is constantly instigated and developed into a life imperative that cannot easily be put to rest. A psychology of moreness, knowing no end. In other words, once you get into this consumption mode, it's hard to get out of it. How many of you fighting your children about these Christmas gifts? And they've been pounded through the year, and now at this point, with all kinds of advertising. And this is another difference I have to talk about. When I was growing up, you know, you got what parents bought you. And the commercial market was pretty much projected toward adults. But now you have a commercial market that is highly segmented, that advertises not to adults only, but that advertises to specific segments in the society, all the way from older people, what do they spend, what are their habits? So you set this ad up this way if you want to get them. The mid-range, mid-age group, the adolescent, young adult group, what kind of music do they listen to? What kind of language do they use? What kind of taste do they have? So we want to set the ad up so that we can talk directly to them. But it doesn't stop only at adolescents. It talks about what? Children. Well, children from 4 to 5 or 5 to 10 are a $3 billion market. They are a market even though they're not working. They're not earning money, but they are a market because they know that these little kids can worry mom and daddy to death. And mom and daddy are going to do what? Buy those gifts. And therefore the little ads are directly shot, directly at them. They internalize them and express them in their attitudes and behavior toward their parents. And their parents are influenced by it, and the money goes out. And it's hard, once you get into it, to stop it. This is what we talk about. It becomes what? Imperative. You can't cut it off. It's like trying to cut off a smoking habit or something. Thus, the attention and energies of people in capitalist society becomes decidedly privatized. Consequently, while the socialization of the owning class members is designed to foster class loyalties and cohesions, the socialization of the propertyless move with opposite effect. And we can see it going in opposite direction. Thus, the development of the working class consciousness is retarded because all of them are caught up in their individual consumption and concern. And yet we'll talk about businessmen, businesswomen, the corporate, group, the business establishment, but we hesitate to talk about groups of others on the lower level. Once again, we see that power is used not only to pursue interest, but to define interest, which is another power that the wealthy and the rich and the owners of production have that the consumer does not have, to define interest. Again, in Black on Black Violence, I talk about there in chapter 8, desiring production, of how tastes are created by the system, and how, in a sense, those things that we own as black people are devalued by the system, and only those things that have value are things owned by the other people. And their advertising establishment and their media creates a taste for everything that you don't have and that you can't make for yourself. That's the only way it can work. How did you gain the taste for what you have today? And I talk about that there. I talked about the crack industry, right? That it is the taste and addiction of the crack addicts that maintains the whole infrastructure of the crack industry. That it is the manipulation of their desire that is the engine that runs the whole thing. That is why the pusher, as pusher, may give away drugs free at the beginning. To do what? Create what? Desire. To produce what? Desire. And desire once produced. And now, since he has the desired products, he now lives off the desire that he's created. And we are all addicts as oppressed people, watching our oppressors create our desires. And what's being created in us, it's our desires that maintain the system. And that group then has a media organization. It has media organizations, not individuals, what? Organizations. Corporation is what? A body. Company is a what? Body. These are what? Groups. But then they'll tell us to act as what? Individuals. They go to work and coordinate their activities. They dress within certain limitations. They talk certain sort of ways. They write certain sort of ways. They express certain types of outlook. They go to school for years so that they can be appropriately shaped to talk, walk, dress, write, perceive the world, so that they can fit into what? An organization and a body, so they can fleece the other individuals in the world. This is what it's about. But then they're going to make you think in terms of blackness, to operate in terms of blackness is unusual, is odd, and it's wrong. But of course, what do I say? Things have to be backwards, don't they? This is the nature of things. Again, speaking about class the other night, to get engaged in black studies is something bad. But what have you been studying? White studies. We make the mistake of thinking that what is white is universal than what is black. And yet, this defies the reality. There are more of us colored folk and non-white folk in the world than white folk. Why do we then continue to perceive whiteness as representing greater universality than blackness? But it has to be that way for this small group to win. So their psychologies don't become white psychology. They just become what? Developmental psychology. And of course, the person reads into that then, that this psychology, since it is not prefixed by a racial term, must be more universal. The education that they provide in these schools is not called white Eurocentric education, it's called what? Standard education. And again, people are taken in to believe that then what is offered in white schools is somehow more universal and race neutral. You see, if it were so race neutral, then why does it seem to maintain that race in the position that it is in. I'll be through shortly here. So the power of the ruling class is used to create taste. One quotation from Tillich: "Modern capitalism is the manifestation of the war of all against all, accepted as principle." And we bought that. The idea that people are always going to be at war against each other as individuals. Hence, an activity motivated always by the impulse to seek one's interests at the expense of others. The peculiarly demonic element in the situation of capitalist society is this: that conflict is not the expression of individual arbitrariness or of chaotic anarchy, but is necessarily bound up with the maintenance of the capitalist economic system, and as a result of that system itself. Let me go back with this. Those people who talk about individualism and privatized consumption and going only for themselves are not really expressing individualism. They have internalized the strongest social and group ideology of all. In other words, it is the ideology of isolated individualism. It is the ideology of unconstrained consumption, consumption unrelated to group purpose and ends, consumption unrelated to community, that is the most communal of ideologies, because it does what? Maintains whom? The white community. You see? In other words, as I've said, we got to be backwards again. In expressing our so-called individuality as black people, we have been duped to the greater extent, and we are acting most within a group concept, because it is that concept imposed upon the oppressed that maintains the power of the oppressor and is the source of the oppressor's wealth and of his power. That is why the more you spend unrelated to community ends and unrelated to community purpose, the poorer we get. The more oppressed we become, the more unemployed we become, you see. The idea of individualized consumption, unconnected to community, is one of the most political and economical ideas we can engage in. That's why we have to look at it very closely. And that's why the more individualized you become in your consumption, the more disconnected you become in your behavior and attitudes, the more, as I said earlier, we will feel the brunt of oppression, and the more the power of others will increase over us. We are not going to spend ourselves out of oppression and by giving our money to our oppressors. The right to spend money anywhere, any place, is not an expression of freedom, but really a part of enchaining ourselves ever more closely to our oppressive conditions. So looking at these facts and looking at the fact that our fundamental conditions had not changed, that we've actually gotten worse in many instances, we began to question this philosophy. Not that we hadn't been questioning it all along, but we had people with this other ideology overlaying us, and by us I'm talking about nationalists. Black nationalism reasserted its influence as Afrocentrism, placed new demands on the social system and on all black Americans. These demands stimulated, and this is what's going on here. Why are we all of a sudden having crisis in identity? At the very moment, we also talked about what? Afrocentrism and African what? Centeredness. So right at this moment, when we are beginning to coalesce and to develop a concept of African identity and Afrocentrism, we are all now suddenly in a what? Identity crisis. Is the identity crisis really there, or is what going on an attempt to do what? Create an identity crisis? Because these people are well aware of what a full and wholesome identity will do to them. And they are aware that an African-centered identity represents the end of white power and of white oppression. That's why I've told you time and time again that at the center of an African-centered education is the overthrow of white power and the breaking of the arms of white power. If you're not educating your children to break white people's power over us, you're miseducating them. If not at the very center of the education of our children is a preparing of them to defeat and destroy white power over us, then you're engaged in an education for servants. You can call it by any name you want to. You can call it multiculturalism. You can even call it Afrocentrism. But if its goal does not have at the center of it the destruction of white folks' power over black folk and the destruction of any other ethnic group's power over black folk, then you're not talking about African-centered education. And ultimately, you're not talking about liberation. You have to keep that in mind. That is a part of it. And that kind of consciousness places new demands on black folk and on this system. So you have some black folk then hearing about Afrocentrism, fear resegregation. In fact, they'll call it what? Self-segregation. These other groups, by the way, who live together and want to stay in their own neighborhoods, fight you and burn your house down when you move in, move their children out so they can keep their children to themselves and educate their children. You know, all of these things. And as a result thereof, you see they have their power and they have control and they have wealth and everything. And then you have some Negro saying segregation of the group represents failure. It's an amazing situation. And I'm going to show you a minute what's going on in this area. But again, it's because they've bought the individualistic philosophy. Because to a good extent, a resegregation for them represents material loss. They fear that the so-called gains and social freedoms that they have achieved, that the so-called successful blacks and the wannabe blacks want to achieve, will be taken from them. And consequently, the more we demand an African-centered consciousness and an African-centered approach to the world, the more they want to dissociate themselves from blackness. I'm not like the rest of them folk over there. Let me in. They fear black power, of course. White people fear black power. If we gain an African-centered consciousness, it means a loss of the black consumer dollar by whites and other non-blacks. And what have I told you before? Because we are such individuals, because we are so free, we, in a sense, are financing Koreans and other children. We are making certain that they don't engage in crime because they don't have to. In a sense, we finance or we disinvest in our own children. And to that extent, we actually instigate criminality in our own. Those of us who don't see color means that we don't see our own children of color. We treat all people the same, even though in reality not all people are the same. Not all white children as a group are equally as poor as black children. But yet you want to see them as the same, and in the end, you end up giving what? Money to people who already have more than they know what to do with. We finance the children of other groups, and then we wonder why our own engage in thievery and other forms of misbehavior. In a sense, then, we create it. We also see a situation here with the changing demographics of this country, the need of this country to what I call Anglo-Saxonize the black middle class, to make honorary blacks as a means of maintaining their position and their power and their wealth when they are no longer even a majority in the United States. To create a neoconservative black class to reward its neoconservatism and move the society from racism to classism. So all of a sudden this society is not going to be so much based on race as it is on class. And that should make the Marxists happy. You know, now we can talk about class because these neo-honorary blacks now become a part of the middle class and the upper ruling class, even though they are not. The black middle class and the black upper class is a subordinate class. It is an underclass. What did I say about this distinction? Because these two classes still don't own anything in this country worth a nickel. They don't own the means of production. This is a salaried class. This is not a real ruling and upper class. This is a misnomer to call these people such. They are still managed by the white middle class. They're still being laid off by white middle class managers out there today. It is still an underclass, but you're going to create this idea of equating these Negroes with being white and so they're in the same class with white folk. You're not in the same class with white folk. I don't care how you dress, how you talk, how you walk, what school you go to, and how you look at the world. In fact, as I've often said, I wouldn't regret it too much if black people really acted like white folk. You know what I'm saying? Yes. In fact, I've said that Farrakhan and others act more like white folk, if you want to play it that way, than Clarence Thomas, or the black conservative. Why? Because white folks say they want to what? Own and control a piece of this what? This earth and this ground. They want to own their neighborhoods. They want to own their businesses. They want to educate their own children. They want real power in the world. They build real nations and so forth. They have their own institutions. They create their own jobs. So man, if you want to act like a white person, go at it. You see, but these Negroes you accuse of acting white are acting just what they are, Negroes. If we really acted like white folk, we would be at war right now. We would be in the business of taking from them the wealth that they have stolen. We wouldn't be concerned with obeying their laws and their rules and all of this business. We would get it the way they got it. Reach in and what? Take it. And then impose our own what? Rules and laws and legitimize our own criminality. That's what white folk do. You go to white schools, they still don't teach you to be white. No, you think you're going to Yale teaching you to be white? You're being taught to be a bigger Negro than ever. Just the fact that you're at that school should teach you something. Where's your own? Where's your research universities? How are you going to protect yourself against the onslaught of AIDS and other disease, using your own research institution, using your own hospitals, using your own defense establishment against germ warfare and so forth? You're not being taught to act like white folk, you're taught to act like Negroes. So the Afrocentrism invoked in whites and among blacks a need, particularly among whites, for a degraded black mass to maintain its social cohesion and economic dominance. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, this whole social system is maintained by the degradation of black people. That is why Afrocentrism and African identity is so frightening to the system. This is why a communal identity is so frightening to the system. I've indicated to you earlier that it is this privatized consumer approach to the world that maintains it. When people start then spending their money responsibly in terms of themselves and in terms of their self-development and not just throwing it over to other people, when people start behaving in terms of their communal development and power, when another community has depended upon our being divided and dependent upon our acting as individuals unconnected one to the other, then our coming together and creating a community and creating a single consciousness represents the end of that destruction and the end of that power. So at the point when we begin to develop this, we suddenly get an identity crisis. It was stated in Time magazine very clearly that the development of ethnic pride in non-white people threatened the social cohesion of America, because it was the lack of that pride that maintained it. So then, as we'll end it here, and I just want to look and mention some other things here. And again, I say it's good to look at the format of things and look at the timing of things. At the same time that we are having a so-called identity crisis in the black community, and at the same time we are accused of being engaged in racial fascism and so forth, at the same period, it's interesting that you get a whole spate of articles in these very same papers that talk about the great ethnic growth and development of other groups. Again, in the living section of the New York Times, Wednesday, December 11, 1991, along 90 blocks of New Jersey, a new world of Latin taste. Is it wrong for these people? I don't see any condemnation of this group of people. 90 blocks. And it goes on and on for page after page, talking about this unpeeling the multiple strata of Latin cultural lore on Bergen Line Avenue, and how this avenue, Bergen Line Avenue, which extends for 90 blocks through Union City and West New York, just across the Hudson from Manhattan, and what great delights you will experience when you go over there. What great foods and so forth. What a great essence of culture that we will experience when you go over there. And how this population is increasing faster than any other population in New Jersey. To shop and eat along the avenue where English is seldom spoken is to cover thousands of miles and a half a dozen diverse Latin cultures in an afternoon. Where is the condemnation of the ethnic identity here? And what do we see the result of this? What do we see this ethnic identity resulting in? People creating opportunities for themselves. People creating jobs for themselves. People creating wealth for themselves. People creating economic and political power for themselves. Why aren't they not having an identity crisis? And why is their identity so great while our identity is so bad? Another paper, same time, Tim, I'm talking in the same time frame, just to show you the contradiction here. December 7th, wider mosaic, suburbs jobs luring immigrants. They talk about Tarrytown, 40% of the population, Latino, openly talking about how they're going to take political power in this part of New York City. Not negativity there. Same papers, New York Times, December 2nd, McDonald's rich Taiwanese backer. Here we have on the nook of the 29th floor, a new office building in this city is a 2-month-old company whose 40 employees scribble memos, hold meetings, receive guests, but have not yet manufactured a single product. Now the novice company is raising eyebrows and a few tempers with a plan to pay as much as $2 billion for a large chunk of McDonnell Douglas Corporation. McDonnell Douglas Corporation being the largest U.S. military contractor. How is this coming together, ladies and gentlemen? Because people are acting as individuals, they're buying 40% of this company. Because there's an individual investor here? No. The Taiwan Aerospace Corporation is no fly-by-night operation, rather the high-priority venture of a government with $76 billion in foreign exchange reserves, more than any other nation. So coming together as a group, with the consciousness of a group, they come to own American production facilities and American wealth. Same paper talking about an identity crisis in the black community. What do we have going on here? One more, we talk But I just want you to look over the total paper sometimes. Just don't read stories. Look at the total design of the paper and see the contradictions here. Same kind of paper, Thursday, December 25th, the power of the yen winning Asia. The new co-prosperity is displacing the U.S. How the Japanese are displacing the U.S. in Asia as a major investment group there. And stated very clearly, we are investing in Asia because we share an Asian culture. And based on that shared culture, we're going to invest our money here and grow here and develop here. No condemnation here. Next piece, and I'll be through here December 4th. Same time all this identity crisis is occurring. The intractable trade issues with Japan evoke a sense of nation's departure. And it talks in this piece about how Japan has changed its investment from the United States and now is placing most of its investment in Asia. From 1985 through 1990, Japan made direct investments abroad of $239 billion, of which $110 billion went to the United States. During the same period, just $5.3 billion of direct investment entered Japan from all other sources. What? We're investing in you, but you're not what? Investing in us. $240 billion outside, and we only letting what? $5 billion come into us. And now we represent businesses between 1982 and 1987, a growth that equaled 1,000% increase, as against a black increase in business of some 38%. Representing what? Group power and group identity. And those people as individuals, because they belong to these groups, who will own parts of America, who will own wealth, will be perceived and acted and related to as individuals. How can you love all children and not teach your own and love your own? Yeah, we got some people, they just love the world, but they can't love their own. How can you love all colors when you cannot love your own, when you choose not to see your own color? How can you love yourself and be happy with yourself and then want to flee from yourself? How can you love to kiss your own lips and hold yourself in your own arms? Talk sweet talk to yourself, laugh at your own jokes, and then want to be someone else. How do you love all mankind and not love your own kind? Aren't we mankind as well? How, if you don't know how to love yourself, how would you know how it feels to love yourself? How would you know how to love someone else if you do not know how to love yourself? And how do you know and how it truly feels to be in love and to love if you cannot feel love for yourself and your own? How dare you talk about love? How can you create universal harmony and unity when there is disharmony in your family and disunity in your community? But yet you're going to harmonize the world. You may not know who you are, but the world knows you. You may not know your name, but the world has given you one, whether you answer to it or not. There is only one way to go, ladies and gentlemen, and that's the way of reclaiming our African selves and our African minds.